Ahoy! Hello, greetings, welcome to everyone. So our Eurocentrism continues as today we look at the scientific revolution and the beginnings of the Enlightenment in Europe. I'm going to start back in the 16th century and carry forward into the 18th century. And not just talk about the development of modern science, but also set up a discussion of political philosophers like John Locke and some others that will be critically important in our examination of the revolutions that take place in the Atlantic world that will be the subjects of our next lecture. When we look at the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, it'll be critical to understand the thinking and the writings and publications of individuals like Locke. So that is sort of where we're headed. But let's take a step back. And look at the origins of the scientific revolution, which is, you might say, a fundamental reevaluation of the nature of the universe and mankind's place in the universe. A questioning, in other words, of what we had always understood to be the nature of our universe and man's place in it. Questioning that, reevaluating that. And in this case, it is undertaken by a group of scientists in Europe who challenge, again, long-held assumptions about the earth and about the heavens and about mankind. And again here, as we've done in this class before, it begs the question, you have to ask, why Europe? Why not the Arab Muslim world? Why not China? China is the most technologically advanced civilization as of about 1500. Thousands-year-old intellectual traditions in China, institutions that have held firm through invasions and foreign rule and so on, influencing in perhaps an entire continent. The sheer power of Confucian ideas, consider though. Nobody challenged Confucian ideas. Nobody challenged the assumption that China was the celestial empire and that the very empire of China was the center of the universe, with the emperor being the son of heaven and the dynasty being given the mandate of heaven. And remember, Confucianism always fell back on its own traditions. Maybe, too, it's the Chinese conceptions of order, which is prized so much throughout Chinese history, as opposed to, remember, in Europe, we've stressed competition between these European nation states. Maybe it's the Chinese emphasis on harmony with nature in Confucian thought, as opposed to Europeans trying to figure out ways that you might say to not just figure out the laws of nature, but to dominate nature. Or maybe it's as simple as something I'd alluded to earlier. All the best and brightest minds in China, at least if they are male, what do? The smartest individuals in China, what is the number one thing they want to do and achieve?
Do well in those tests.
Do well in the civil service exam and get a job in the bureaucracy, right? So that's a good system of government. It's a meritocracy. It's great to have all of your smartest and hardest working people in jobs that suit them, but it doesn't really help you innovate and change and reevaluate things, because you've got those people, working on building bridges and infrastructure, or running the tax system, or running the customs system, or administering things along the Great Wall or the Great Canal and so on. They're not, in other words, thinking outside the box and experimenting and publishing scholarly works where they're reevaluating things. Does that make sense? Whereas in Europe, the best and brightest minds can be doing all those things, because they're not necessarily working in some bureaucratic job somewhere, but this was China at the time. So that meritocracy under the civil service examination system might well have misserved China in a certain way. In any case, if we're looking not just counterfactually at why not China or why not here or there, and more specifically to why Europe, I think you can look at the influence at this point of Renaissance thought. We began this entire course looking at the Renaissance. The rebirth of European civilization through the revitalization of classical Greek and Roman learning and culture. Well, similarly here, there's going to be a rediscovery of classical science, of classical philosophy. Just as with the Renaissance, it is often through Arab texts in the Muslim world, translated from the original Greek. But here in science, rather than just rediscovery and recreation and maybe improvement here or there, you have a challenging of classical thought. What we have here is not just the rediscovery of classical science and philosophy, but a fundamental questioning of classical science's assumptions. That's the key. And breakthroughs here that overturn many of those assumptions. So not just rediscovery of classical science and philosophy, but questioning it, discovering things that disprove it, discredit it, overturn it, and establishing new fundamental norms. This will give rise to the birth of modern science as we know it. Does that make sense? Well, it begins with a revolution in astronomy. The first major breakthrough is the acceptance of the theory of a heliocentric universe. What do heliocentric or geocentric mean? It'll start with what was the commonly held belief going back to the classical age, the idea of a geocentric universe. Geo is in geography or geology. What does that mean? What does the geo in any of those mean? Earth. The geocentric theory, then, in other words, is the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. This is the geocentric model, the idea that Earth is in the middle, and around it in concentric spheres move the moon, and beyond that Venus, and then beyond that the sun, and then Mars, and then beyond that are the stars. This dated back to classical Greece. And remember, this is about not just rediscovering, but challenging ancient thought. And it dovetailed with the philosophy of Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, and his hierarchy of matter, which asserted that some objects in the world were simply better and closer to divine, and thus rose up towards the heavens. So when smoke and flame rise up in the air towards the heavens, that's because they are of a higher order. Other Greek philosophers advanced this understanding of nature and the place of Earth in the universe. Ptolemy tried to prove that the Earth was fixed at the center of the universe and followed in those concentric crystalline spheres by the moon and the sun and the known planets and then the stars, like you see in that diagram there at top right. And then the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages imposed its own addendums on this model, saying that beyond the last sphere lay heaven and the throne of God and the angels who were responsible for moving those spheres around the earth. So this would be your Christian geocentric model. At the center of it all, earth and mankind. which dovetails with the teachings of the Christian Bible. Of course, in the middle of that is hell. But beyond that, the spheres of the moon and Mercury and Venus, the sun is in the middle of all that, and Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the stars beyond that. But beyond that is paradise and heaven and the throne of God.
Was this just based on theory? Was it just a theory? Is that what they were?
Theory, and I'm going to use this word advisedly, observation, and I say advisedly because systematic observation using new tools is going to be fundamental to what we're about to see and the reevaluation of this. So when I say observation, I mean looking up in the sky and saying, well, there's what appears to be the stars, and we know that's the sun and that's the moon, and it appears to be good. So there's some observation of the heavens, right? And from what they can tell, what's where and how it moves before the development of a really good telescope. Does that make sense? So imagine, they've got kind of an idea that there are things out there in the sky that appear to be rotating around the earth to their eye and their understanding. But consider how flawed in a number of ways from what we actually know. Just take, for example, that you've got Earth in the middle and the sun rotating around the Earth in the middle of the known planets, right? So they don't have a sophisticated enough way to observe the heavens to fundamentally challenge the way that the church had told you it always been. Does that make sense? And which dovetailed with classical learning or classical thought about, where is Earth in the universe? And certainly in the classical world, they had no, sophisticated ability to observe what we would call space, right? What they would call the heavens. That being said, by the 16th century, by the 1500s, you begin to see people attempt to scientifically, systematically argue that this is wrong. And that based upon their observations and based upon their mathematics, that it's different. Those two things are absolutely fundamental. Observation, sophisticated observation using new tools, and mathematics. It's no coincidence that I'm about to run down a string of individual scientists and say repeatedly, this person was a mathematician at so-and-so institution. So you can observe, and can you prove it with the math? First one we're going to look at is Copernicus. Nicholas Copernicus is a Polish-German mathematician, and the first to sophisticatedly, scientifically argue for a heliocentric model. What's helios? I have to do some Latin in here. I failed Latin in college, so that tells you really don't want to be getting it from me. Helios, the sun. Centric center. The heliocentric model would hold that the sun is in fact the center of the universe. And that the Earth and other planets revolve around the sun. And we know that part is true, that the Earth and the planets do in fact revolve around the sun. Now for Copernicus, though, he holds that the sun is motionless at the center of the universe, and that the Earth and the planets revolved around it. The sun doesn't move. But the apparent movement of the sun in the sky was the product of the rotation of Earth on its axis and around the sun. Now that part, again, we know to be true, right? The Earth is rotating constantly, and at the same time is moving around the sun. Copernicus was able to figure out, using observation, reason, and mathematics, that is why it appears as if the sun is moving throughout the sky, right? It's not that the sun is revolving around Earth. In fact, Earth is simultaneously rotating on its own axis and moving around the sun, right? Does that make sense? Now, where did Copernicus fall short, though? What's he got wrong here? Well, number one, the sun is not motionless, nor is it the center of the universe, right? What he got right was a general conception of our solar system, right? That these planets are in fact rotating on their own axes and also rotating around the sun. So we're getting there. It's baby steps. There were fundamental flaws, too, in Copernicus's math. He couldn't quite make it work based on observation of the path of the known planets and the sun. He couldn't make it make sense on paper. So he could never really, truly prove it. And again, this is his model. You have the concentric spheres still, right? But in this case, it's the planets rotating within themselves and around the sun. Why couldn't he make the math work? What's wrong with that model, other than obviously the sun not being the center of the universe and not being motionless? It's up to another individual, Johannes Kepler, to make the math work by one simple tweak. So, if you're Copernicus, this will challenge my ability to draw a circle. Sad. Sad. So that's a circular orbit. If this is the sun, we have Earth in a circular orbit. Using observation and trying to make the numbers fit, that didn't work. So it was up to Kepler to realize, and not knowing precisely why this was so yet, but to realize that the orbits of these planets are not perfect circles. What are they? Ellipses. They look like that. Elongated. Once Kepler figured that out, all of a sudden all the numbers start to fall in place. Still, there were not a whole lot of supporters of this theory at that time. And it is denounced by the Roman Catholic Church and Protestant leaders, including Martin Luther, and even some other scientists of the day. Now, think particularly about the Christian church here. The geocentric theory meant mankind was the center of the universe, which dovetails with the teachings of the Christian church. But also at a time during the Reformation where people are coming to question the church's authority and question the validity of what the institutional church had been telling people for generations. And some began to think, well, if we're challenging the church in terms of its corruption or its liturgy or its dogma or doctrine, why not question the church's science? Nonetheless, the Roman Catholic Church especially remains incredibly powerful, and scholars, budding scientists who had challenged the teachings of the church had already been burned at the stake, executed for challenging the church's teachings. So much so was the threat that Nicholas Copernicus was afraid to publish his master work on the revolution of heavenly spheres. He does not publish it until he's on his deathbed. Figures I'm dying anyway, and publish this now. They can't kill me now. Similar problem will be faced by Galileo. Galilei we'll look at, but first here is a version of the heliocentric model with the elliptical orbits of the known planets. Galileo is an Italian mathematician who lives in the late 1500s and into the mid 1600s. So he is active in the late 16th, early 17th century. Lives quite a long time for back in that day. He's often considered the father of modern physics. Anybody had to take physics yet? Failed that too. Eventually passed it. Passed it in high school. Things were easier then. Physics is the study of matter and motion through space and time. Matter and motion through space and time. Key to the understanding of physics, and when you do take it, this will be the very first thing that you learn probably, the principle of accelerated motion. Connecting velocity to distance and time. And in the process then, understanding objects in motion certain laws of nature that would tend to completely overthrow Aristotle's hierarchy of matter. So the development of physics allows you to move beyond the classical model of Aristotle and Ptolemy and others in this obviously dramatically incorrect hierarchy of matter. Galileo is also considered the father of observational astronomy, the study of space through observation and calculation. I say modern. I talked about, when you asked the question earlier, how, yes, that people were observing the heavens, or what we would call space, but they lacked the necessary means for systematic and sophisticated observation. And so it's Galileo who uses a sophisticated and newly invented telescope to observe hundreds of previously undetected stars, moons. He detects sunspots on the sun. He detects so much that it seems to suggest that maybe the sun is not the center of the universe either. Maybe the sun is but one of many, many stars in a universe that might in fact be infinite. So big that we don't even know how big it may be. It is endless, perhaps. We cannot observe any end to it. So we're getting closer here to the reality and understanding that the sun is not the center of the universe either. We're one solar system among maybe billions. And his observations also seem to suggest that the heavens, as they would have called it, space out there, it is composed of matter similar to that on Earth. It is not, in fact, heavenly. It is not some otherworldly realm. And you see how this is a direct challenge into the church. He's suggesting that out there beyond the stars, that's not heaven or paradise where the angels are moving concentric spheres. That's just more matter in the universe, same as it is here. So what Galileo then does is tries to prove this without a doubt using advanced observation, a new telescope, and advanced mathematics. In fact, he is the first, and I mean beyond even Copernicus and Kepler, he is the first to totally divorce his theory from anything but physical bodies obeying laws of motion. Nothing spiritual whatsoever. And here I would add that Kepler was a mystic who thought that the planets and stars were souls. And Copernicus, again, believed the sun to be the center of the universe, to be the lamp of nature, and to be the image of God. Galileo here his theory has nothing to do whatsoever with anything spiritual. It's all about observation, mathematics, and laws of nature. Which he takes to the next level, arguing that biblical theory was not in any way scientific in any meaningful sense, which is clearly a blatant threat to the church. Beyond the fact that he's saying the heavens are not heavenly and they're just made of matter. So perhaps it is no surprise that the church arrests him and forces him to recant under threat of torture. He has to say, I take it back. I actually believe any of those things. Remember, they did this to Luther, and Luther refused because he had friends and could escape. Galileo was not so sure, and so he recants, and supposedly, probably an apocryphal story, like in other words, didn't actually happen. Supposedly, Galileo's got his fingers crossed behind his back, or utters something like, "Well, I really do," because we want to believe that he didn't, back down in the face of these threats from the church. Spends the rest of his life under house arrest, basically, under the watchful eye of church authorities. The torch is passed, though, to Newton. Isaac Newton. Once again, a mathematician, a professor of physics. He lives from the mid-1600s to the early 1700s, so he's active as a scholar in the late 17th and early 18th century. Professor of math and physics at Cambridge University in England. who not only invents calculus, the advanced mathematical study of rates of change that perhaps some of you will have to take, calculus, but he also produces a general model of science. He's the first to produce a synthesis of all these new breakthroughs. And we have focused up to this point on astronomy, but there are breakthroughs in medicine, and chemistry, and biology, and of course understanding what are the laws of nature, the nature of movement, obviously physics. And he's the first to replace the old Aristotelian and Ptolemaic models, the idea of the hierarchy of matter, the quote-unquote science of the church. And so when he publishes the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, or the Principia, in 1687, he provides that general theory. He provides that general model of science. This becomes like the scientific Bible, if you will. In it, he describes 3 laws of motion that apply equally to objects on Earth and in space. What are the young Newton's 3 laws of motion? What are they? I know you ought to learn this. Perhaps promptly forget it. An object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by another force, right? An object at rest will stay at rest unless acted upon by some outside force. And for any action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That is, any motion or action is equivalent to the force that is applied to it, right? But additionally, he also proposes the theory of universal gravitation. The idea that gravity is a force. Due to the rotation and motion of the Earth, that matter is drawn to the center of the Earth by the force of gravity, which is a constant force, a quantifiable force. And that all bodies in the universe, and not just on Earth, are subject to that force. And that this is what accounts for things like the elliptical orbits of the planets around the sun. Because there's gravity drawing them around and sort of throwing them around the sun, the same as the moon is thrown around in orbit of the Earth because the Earth has gravity. And these objects are at rest because the force of gravity is drawing them to the floor. With this, he is able to accurately describe a heliocentric solar system with elliptical orbits within an infinite universe, all of which is supported by mathematics and observation. And he produces a theory that would stand for 200 years until it was replaced in the 20th century by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which is not a major overturning of the Newtonian model, but only a more sophisticated one. This is a triumph for the scientific method. The idea that you start with a theory or a hypothesis, but it's got to be tested and proven through observation, through mathematics. Theory, hypothesis, testing, observation, mathematics, conclusion. Theory either proven or disproven or modified. So despite the power of conservative thought, despite the enduring power of the Roman Catholic Church and Protestant churches, there would be from this moment no turning back from the acceptance within science of a universe governed by laws of nature that are observable and mathematically provable. By the 1600s and certainly into the 18th century, philosophers begin to apply the scientific method to the understanding of all human life. and we see the birth of modern philosophy. You know, if you go back to the classical world, to ancient Greece and Rome, there's little distinction between philosophy and science. Things that seem probably blatantly separate in our minds were conflated in the ancient world. But here we will see a strict split between the two, a revolution in philosophy that's part of the same movement to resurrect but then challenge classical philosophical and scientific thought. Let's look at Francis Bacon, an English philosopher of what they call the empirical school of thought. So you know what this means when you have a school. It doesn't mean like I'm going to school or I attend this school, although I guess it could mean that in the latter sense. It means a group of individuals, you know, teachers, philosophers, professors who are influenced by a particular way of thinking, and sometimes particular individuals. So if I sent you all out into the world as scholars and influenced the way you think about world history and all these things, we would say, you come from the Bagley School of History. But this is the empirical school. Empiricists rely first and foremost on observation. Start, if you're an empiricist, with systematic observation of the physical world, and then test any hypotheses through experimentation. To use, in other words, what we call inductive reasoning. Observation first, hypotheses, rigorous testing, conclusion. This would be as opposed to another school of thought which depended upon deductive reasoning, which gave primacy or greater weight to human beings' ability to think, to reason. This school is most especially associated with the French philosopher René Descartes. And even though we're getting into philosophy here, we're still talking about folks who are double dipping in mathematics, and I mention this almost just anecdotally. You know Descartes, I guarantee you do, through one of two things. I know you guys had to at least take geography, you've had some algebra, maybe you've had pre-calc or cal, so everybody's seen this, right? That's the Cartesian plane, named for Descartes. He's also responsible for the pithy aphorism, I think, therefore I am. Like the essence of existence is your ability to think and reason, according to Descartes. So naturally, you would give primacy to that first, as opposed to observation. You would think and reason and come up with some theory, and then perhaps you could test that through observation. So Descartes rejects following the senses and relying upon observation first, and instead emphasize instinct and the power of human thought. He's the first to postulate or put forth the idea of the separation of the mind and the body, of mind and matter, which further sort of underscores why he would say you need to use reason to understand the material world. Forget what you've been taught. Use reason, develop a theory, test that theory with observation and mathematics. What's probably most important here, beyond the differences between inductive and deductive reasoning, or the rational school and the empirical school, is that neither one of them is talking about theology, neither one of them is talking about the Bible or biblical truth, neither one of them is talking about the Word of God, neither one of them is talking about the interpretations of the church and so on. In other words, this marks the separation of philosophy from theology. Philosophy separate from religion entirely. That all make sense? Well, in that case, I want to look at two political philosophers, both from Bacon's empirical school of thought. Who produced two theories of why we as human beings even have governments and what is the function or the nature of those governments. And what would the ideal form of government be? The first of these is Thomas Hobbes. The second is John Locke. Both of these individuals are practitioners of what we call social contract theory, which should be on the PowerPoint. Social contract theory. So what is social contract theory, and how are these guys empiricists as political philosophers? Well, if you're an empiricist, remember, you believe in the primacy of observation, observing. And these two individuals, Hobbes and Locke, begin their thought process, their sort of point of departure, you might say, by imagining human beings in something called the state of nature. The state of nature. A theoretical world in which you have human beings, but you have no government. The state of nature. So you observe, and I use observe in quotation marks here because you're not actually looking at it, you're imagining it. But you observe, what would it look like speculatively if we look at human beings in a state of nature? That is a world in which there are no governments. Hobbes and Locke are going to see that differently. For Hobbes, he sees human beings in that state of nature as inherently competitive. Almost mean-spirited, out for one another, out for themselves, for resources, water, food, land, whatever it may be. Competing with one another, killing one another. According to Hobbes, the state of nature would see a war of all against all. And that to have an effective government under such a circumstance, you would need to enter into a social contract. The process of human beings creating government would involve entering into this theoretical social contract. For Hobbes, that would mean, ideally, human beings would voluntarily surrender their rights to an absolute monarch, who then would prevent this war of all against all by maintaining control. An absolute monarch would have the authority to maintain some semblance of order in the world by preventing human beings, from killing one another for access to resources and their competitiveness. In other words, Hobbes is endorsing the kind of government we saw under Louis XIV in France, absolutism. And the idea that in the modern world, moving into, the 18th century, that an absolute monarch could build, not a clunky and ineffective state that we end up knowing that Louis did, but perhaps a large bureaucratic state that could become some sort of Leviathan. Plucking that out of the Bible, this gigantic creature, this Leviathan, but run by one absolute monarch. But note that it was a social contract. Human beings voluntarily gave up their rights so this monarch could keep order. So even under Hobbes' conception of absolutism, you have consent of the governed. How is that different from the reign of Louis XIV? Where did he derive his authority from, supposedly? Divine right, yeah. From God. This is different. Hobbes is conceptualizing a more or less voluntary absolute monarchy in which in the social contract you surrender your rights because the monarch will maintain order. And his great publication setting forth these theories is titled Leviathan. And then we have Locke, who sees things very John Locke is an English philosopher who's writing in the late 1600s, early 1700s, roughly same time as Hobbes. He observes human beings in the state of nature, but he sees it very differently than Hobbes. He sees human beings as inherently cooperative. He sees the sort of, to quote Abraham Lincoln, better angels of their nature, if you will. Human beings is inherently cooperative. And for Locke, ideally what would happen as human beings entered into the social contract to create a government, they would only surrender some, a bare minimum of their rights when creating a government. Enough to allow the government to govern, with the consent of the governed, of course, voluntary social contract. But here's the key. According to Locke, it would be the government's responsibility then to protect the rest of your individual rights. To put that another way, according to John Locke, the essence and the purpose of having a government is to protect individual rights. According to Locke, this is why you would have a government. That would be its primary goal, not just to maintain order, but to protect individual rights, especially to life, liberty, and property. Those are, according to Locke, your most fundamental rights. Your life, your liberty, or your freedom, in other words, and your right to own and have property. And that sounds familiar. It's understandable because you're probably beginning to see it's Locke's ideas that are fundamental to the American Revolution. So according to John Locke, when you enter into the social contract, human beings only surrender some of their rights. It becomes the number one purpose of government to protect the rest of your individual rights, most especially life, liberty, and property. And it is the purpose then of government to maintain a general welfare of citizens. These are the fundamental tenets of classical liberalism. Say what you want about Hobbes and Leviathan. At least it's an ethos. This too is an ethos. This says, when I say tenets, these are the fundamental underlying assumptions of classical liberalism. Liberal is a word we use in our politics now to mean something a lot more specific. Like if we had, Republican and Democrat over here, the Republican would say to the Democrat, well, you're too liberal for me. That's something very, very specific. When we say classical liberalism, or what sometimes referred to as Lockean liberalism, this is much broader. If you're a Republican in this country, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Libertarian, if you're a Green Party, whatever, unless you are a fringe radical, you are a classical liberal. Which means you believe it is the primary purpose of the government to protect your individual rights and maintain the general welfare. Does that make sense? So try to disassociate the word here from its current political meaning, if that makes sense. Hopefully by now you're beginning to see, because I very purposely equated Hobbes's theory with Louis XIV, even though it would be different because of consent of the governed as opposed to divine right, that you'll think back to that lecture and how I compared France to Britain. And how Britain, as it becomes a constitutional monarchy step by step from Magna Carta to Glorious Revolution to Bill of Rights and Civil War and so on, it is trending towards at least the rule of law, away from the rule of kings and nobles and towards the rule of law. What does it mean to live under the rule of law, which we here in America do? It means you no longer would have a social order in which you have nobles and aristocrats who are entitled, literally, to high positions, or a monarch even with restricted power. The fundamental authority in a society governed by the rule of law would be an actual physical manifestation of the social contract. a constitution. If you have the rule of law, that means that constitution is the social contract, and it is the foundation upon which your entire society rests. No one is above the rule of law. In effect, that constitution replaces the king. Does that make sense? So Britain is not quite there. But what we're going to see, imagine, and Locke and Hobbes, none of them could have ever known, I think, that within one generation, in the mid and late 1700s, in the far-flung colonies of Britain in North America, that a group of individuals would find themselves situated such that if they could win a war to protect the integrity of the colonies in which they lived, they would then be free to imagine that they were in a state of nature. If they overthrew the British government, they would then be in a position to form a government from scratch. It would be an actual manifestation to a certain extent of the theoretical state of nature imagined by Locke and Hobbes. They would get to start from the ground up and replace the old order with something entirely new based upon the teachings of Locke and others. Philosophers of the Enlightenment. And they would be able to take what they felt like were the best ideas of that Enlightenment and put them into practice. And they would eventually draft and enact a constitution that would provide for the rule of law in the United States of America, based upon these principles of classical liberalism. Does that make sense? Well, that's the upshot then. And note that neither Locke nor Hobbes was concerned at all with addressing theology, the church, the Bible. So you had then the complete separation of political philosophy from religion as well. But we'll carry forth then with the legacy of the scientific and philosophical revolutions. And it's important to note again the rise and the primacy of reason and observation. Each will be very important to that coming age of enlightenment I mentioned, which will be our point of departure in the next lecture.
Right there.
Always replacing a light or something, I don't know. We're done anyway. And the Enlightenment then itself is intimately tied to these democratic Atlantic world revolutions that we'll be looking at in the next lecture. We'll paint with a very broad brush and probably try, as I tend to do, throw in way too much into one lecture and try and cover it. We're going to look at the American Revolution, which is followed upon with a revolution in France, which is much more radical, but also far more problematic. Then we will look at the most radical revolution of all, which ends up including a slave rebellion, a successful one at that, in Haiti. And we'll also really briefly look at how all of those inspire various revolutions throughout Spanish Latin America and the revolutionary leader Simón Bolívar. And also, we will explore moving forward how this new science is going to be crucial to the development of an industrial revolution in Europe, which is more than anything else the key to understanding how this backwater of a society that is Europe ends up rising to dominate the world for a century or two. So the Industrial Revolution is key. Those will be the subjects of our next few lectures. I think after the next one you have quiz 3, is that correct? So that would include this lecture, Atlantic World lecture, and the next one. I'm pretty sure that's right. All right, well, that's it. I'm going to go watch the Braves.